Thank you, and thank you to the zetkin.forum for organizing such an important event, and to all the organizers. I'm Mònica Clua Losada, and I work at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and I've also been invited here by the Candidatures for Popular Unity, which is a movement part of the independentist left in Catalonia. So I will go through some of the main issues in the rise of the extreme right, connecting it to authoritarian neoliberalism and seeing what's the relationship between neoliberalism and the extreme right in Spain and Catalonia, but actually from a global perspective. Okay, so there will be quite a lot of things here that are quite global for two reasons, because I don't think you can understand the current period without looking at it from these global dynamics that are happening, but also because for the last 10 years, I've actually been living in the United States, and I've only recently moved back to Catalonia. And so I lived in one of the worst parts of the United States, the laboratory of fascism, which was Texas. And so I very often say that, unfortunately, I come from a very dark future. And so many of the things that we might see and might not fully understand are things that I have been living under for the past 5, 6, 8 years of my life, and perhaps I do see them in different ways. The key argument really that I want to make at the theoretical level is neoliberalism is actually a failed class project. We have been living under neoliberalism. People often say 40 years. That is because they forget Chile, so it's more like 50 years of life under neoliberalism as an unfinished hegemonic project. And the reason why I say it's a failed project, a failed class project, is because Thatcher's dream of there is no such thing as a society was never materialized. Okay? In those 50 years, they never managed to break us as a society, no matter how hard they tried to atomize us, to disintegrate societies, to turn us all into what Thatcher wanted us to turn, which was individuals and families. And actually, what we're doing right now is a perfect example of that failure to do so. In light of that failure, after the 2008 crisis, neoliberalism reinvented itself. And it reinvented itself with something called, or what we've called, many of us in the academia, but also in social movements, authoritarian neoliberalism. This takes shapes in many different ways. For some people, this was a new thing after 2008. If you talk to anyone from Chile, they'll say, well, was neoliberalism ever non-authoritarian? What are you talking about? If you talk to someone like me from Catalonia, might also tell you, guess what, the Spanish state has always been authoritarian. And so I'm not sure what it is that we're seeing different. But there really was a kind of even further authoritarian turn, particularly at the EU level, okay, that we all witnessed with austerity politics, and took different shapes in different places. In Catalonia, for example, the political project behind this authoritarian neoliberalism was a now defunct political party called Ciutadans, which represented very much sections of Spanish finance capital with a very direct discourse against Catalan national aspirations, as well as as I mentioned, an authoritarian neoliberal class project. But what we're now seeing, particularly since 2014-15, everywhere, and also in Catalonia and Spain, is a reactivation of existing networks and diffusion of US imperialism in ways that are not just happening at the level of political parties. We've been talking quite a lot over the last 2 days, and particularly today, about the different parties, different brands of party that is here and there. I don't disregard that is important, but I don't think that is the key issue if we are trying to understand what the far right or the extreme right, or however you want to call them, are doing. Because what they're doing is actually a truthful Gramscian project. They're not trying to win an election with party A. That is not really what's at stake here. What's at stake is changing society. It's that initial failed class project. Going back to that, and this time is if we cannot break society, let's try and make sure that society is ours. So they do that in many different ways. For example, through the evangelical church and the rise of the evangelical church in many, many places, the United States, of course, all over Latin America. Again, any Latin Americans here will say, well, this is not news. We kind of knew that for a long time. It's happening in the Spanish state, for example. The evangelical church is the largest growing religious group for the last decade, by a long shot, okay? Really enormous. We then have the second element of changing our societies, which is the international reactionary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That is basically all the conglomerate of all the different foundations. We've already, in the last 2 days, we've talked about things like the Heritage Foundation. I'll be talking a little bit about the Atlas Network and some of those. And the third prong is the micropolitics of the far right. Again, they're trying to really change society from below. Right? The intellectuals behind the far right project, they seem to, as I mentioned, not just understand Gramsci, but also increasingly understand a lot of the autonomous thinking of the past 40 years or so. And it might be time that, since in a way they're copying us, that we start understanding what it is that they're doing. It's a double strategy, for example. In terms, for example, with migration, what we're seeing in the Spanish state context is, on the one hand, the demonization of migrants or certain migrants, particularly through methods such as Islamophobia, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because that is perhaps even stronger in Catalonia, for example, while simultaneously organizing part of migrant communities. In the case of the Spanish state and Catalonia, primarily, for example, some Latin American communities, okay? So there is a kind of double strategy. We don't demonize all migrants, some might be happening. In fact, today, the Washington Post ran a full-length story about how many Latin American migrants were now prioritizing migration to Spain rather than the United States due to the situation, etc. That it's a well-known factor. The upper class of Venezuela's migration to places like Madrid, but also cities like Barcelona, and the direct funding to things like far-right news media, etc., etc. So that is one of the things. And why? Why is that happening? And why, besides the fact that I'm from Catalonia, why do I think it is an interesting place to look at? I think it's an interesting place to look at because what we're witnessing, or the threat that we're witnessing, oh, it didn't move. What we're witnessing is a reaction or an attempt to discipline all those different movements and groups of movements that actually dared to dream dangerously over the last decade. Right? Examples from the different, globally, obviously, Occupy and Wall Street and all the different types of occupies. In the Spanish state context, the 15 AM occupation of the squares, and the ultimate culmination of all the anti-austerity movements of that decade in Catalonia in the 1st of October referendum, with a whole set of dreams of emancipation attached to it, with, in fact, 2 days later, the 3rd of October, the largest ever general strike to have ever happened in that context. We became dangerous. We weren't just dreaming dangerously, this was dangerous. This was basically an uprising. You cannot have a country of 7 million people where you have more than 2 million people actively disobeying in the face of police violence. It wasn't just a few. It was a very large number of the population. So how do we make sense of all of this? I'm not going to bore you with all the theory. I'll just show you very quickly in case you want to follow up. The concept of authoritarian neoliberalism comes, at least from my theoretical tradition, comes from an understanding of authoritarian statism from Nikos Poulantzas and authoritarian populism as coined by Stuart Hall, and therefore connects, on the one hand, the constitutional changes or the legal apparatus changes in terms of isolating individuals, as Poulantzas mentioned, the constitution of the legal individual citizen, combined with Stuart Hall's analysis of Thatcherism and the development of an individual populism. And I'm not going to go necessarily through that. This then gets coined by Ian Brough in 2012 in the journal Rethinking Marxism under authoritarian neoliberalism to try and explain the constitutionalization of austerity that was happening at the EU level. I'm not going to go through how it necessarily happens, but in the context that we care about, how do we see the development of this new wave of authoritarian neoliberalism? We see it through the through the constitutionalization of previously democratic spaces, and that is something that happens throughout the EU. It actually happens through the budget constraints that are forced on EU member states to impose constitutionally deficit caps and therefore impose the austerity for future generations as well, amongst many other things, including some of the memorandums of understanding for Greece, for example, but many other elements that we are aware of. That obviously applies as well in the Spanish state context. In fact, the Spanish constitution is this funny thing that you cannot change, as Catalans know that better than anyone. It's impossible to change. It's just, there's no way you can do it, except, of course, if the Troika asks you to impose austerity for the next generations. If that's the case, change happens very, very quickly, right? So Article 135, which was introduced in the Spanish Constitution, by the way, under a so-called socialist government, wasn't particularly difficult to change. That happened very quickly, but anything else, it's untouchable. That was connected with an increased, throughout the previous decade, an increased judicialization of politics. The judiciary took very much an activist role in the political sphere. The Constitutional Tribunal became very much an upper chamber. Any legislation that was being approved that was not to the liking of the Spanish state was very quickly stopped by the Constitutional Tribunal. The main focus of the actions of the Constitutional Tribunal during the last decade were twofold and very often connected. One was to re-centralize Spanish politics. That was very much one of the aims. But the second very clear aim was to defend capital. Right? So, examples of those bits of legislation. Catalonia approved quite an advanced law in terms of defending the right to housing and curtailing some of the consequences of the 2008 crisis and the amount of toxic assets that had gone to supposedly a toxic bank. Those were actually houses, rather, but they were calling them toxic assets. And there was an element of trying to, since that bank was created with public money, that perhaps those houses could be used for public housing. That was one of the many legislations that were actually turned down by the Constitutional Tribunal. But something else was happening throughout that period, particularly in the Spanish Congress, which was the near elimination of parliamentary debates. And that wasn't something that was new. In fact, I actually have an article where we tracked the elimination of parliamentary debates as the manner of doing, or the natural manner of doing, of the Spanish Congress. And we tracked since 1977 to 2015, and depending on which legislature, you had more or less usage, but the average was over 40%. And that continued. There was not much of a difference whether there was a majority party or not. So even in cases where, in a sense, you could afford debate, because you could let people debate and then you vote, and because you've got the numbers, you win. So debate is pretty much free you just let people speak, and that wasn't happening either. So it became very much that preferred tool for the creation of new legislative measures, but again, it wasn't necessarily something new connected to the crisis, it was part of the nature of the Spanish legislative process. And of course, we had the reaction. The reaction very much matches what is trying to discipline. So whilst we see, for example, in the United States, the kind of grassroots or so-called grassroots, not as grassroots as they would like us to think it is, was the Tea Party as a response to Occupy. In the Spanish context, the reaction was, until recently, very much a reaction against Catalonia, right? So that reaction, that fascist reaction, was a reaction of responding with more Spain. And so you see a lot of the demonstrations. This is actually here one of the demonstrations soon after the 1st of October in favor of kind of a unified, supposed unified Spain, but ultimately one that was very much in favor of or against any kind of emancipation from Catalonia. You have some of the other ones from Madrid as well with the Spanish flags. And it was seen by those global forces very much an attempt to stop the emancipation process that had happened in Catalonia, a way of squashing the revolution that had happened. But it wasn't sufficient. Okay, so all those things, we already see the eruption of parties like Vox or the Ciutadans one that I mentioned before. And yes, they managed to an extent to try and divide society between those that might have been more pro-Spanish or felt more pro-Spanish and those that might have felt more pro-Catalan. But the problem remained. People still continued to dream dangerously, not just only on national terms, but also very much in terms of social emancipation terms. And that was one of the issues. Connected with another issue that we've also been talking a lot, and some of you have been to the demonstration this afternoon. The other issue that comes globally as well, of course, is the genocide in Gaza, right? Not coincidentally, Catalonia is one of the strongholds in Europe and the world of solidarity with Palestine. Okay? Not the only one. It so happens that another country with a history of national liberation, progressive struggles, such as Ireland, finds themselves in the same situation, right? And so we have very clearly a genocide industrial complex that we don't always see it in such terms, but it's very much there. I recommend visiting the Heritage Foundation website. As you probably all know, the Heritage Foundation is very much the think tank behind the current presidency of Trumpism, but it's not a new thing. The Heritage Foundation was a think tank behind Thatcher, behind Reagan. You know, these guys have been around for a long, long time. They're not new on the block. They have a whole report and project on the importance of not just a special relationship with Israel, but a strategic partnership. That's why I'm talking about an actual industrial complex. So I do recommend that the report is actually available on the website, freely available. It's funny, but I've always found it very easily. I was trying to access it yesterday from Berlin, and I struggled a couple of times, including 2 error messages from Google. But so maybe I'm just being paranoid. But I do highly recommend it. Why am I saying this? Because, again, Catalonia has managed to be at that forefront with real direct institutional implications. Not because, in those 2 cases, not because Barcelona City Council is particularly emancipatory. I'm certainly not going to say that. It certainly isn't now. I probably would argue it hasn't been ever, but certainly not now. And certainly the Catalan government at the moment, or the previous one, wasn't particularly emancipatory. But they felt the pressure from below to do something. And when you have a huge tidal wave from below, then institutions sometimes, even if you don't control them, even if you don't like them, they find themselves forced to do things that they would otherwise not do. That's, in a sense, why social movements are actually a good thing in general. So, for example, Barcelona cut twin city ties with Tel Aviv over Israel's war on Gaza. The first story is actually from the Catalan government's website. It was from 2024, where Catalonia appointed a representative for the Catalan Agency for Development Cooperation to Palestine, thereby sending an actual legal representative to Palestine. When these things start happening, and the Heritage Foundation thinks that actually Israel's interests, and as you saw on the two news stories, not just Israel's interests, but Israel's interests in destroying Gaza are essential for the world economy and world power, then you can see why, these places might not be that nice to exist, and how you might want to start crushing some of this. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because I want to also highlight very quickly what I talk about when I talk about the far right, because we all do. I do it, so I'm not, in a sense, criticizing anybody. We use very often interchangeably. I'm the first one to do it. Far right, extreme right. If I like them even less, they're fascists. And everyone is just somewhere in that big sack that, tick whichever or all of the above type of thing. And I think in the current context, we're somewhere where we have a lot of ideological convergence amongst many different groups of people and interests that might not be as friendly to each other as we sometimes make them out to be. As in, this ideological convergence is full of contradictions amongst themselves. In fact, we're seeing it in the last couple of weeks, 3 weeks maybe, in the whole relatively funny conflict between Elon Musk and President Trump, okay? That is kind of one of the examples of how, that marriage of convenience is not always that easy to maintain. So what do I talk about when I talk about the far right, the extreme right, and fascism in the 21st century? On the one hand, the good old authoritarian neoliberals. People like Carl Schmitt, Hayek, Friedman, and their descendants, the Mount Pelerin Society, the different kind of foundations around all of those, the good old guys that we all know. National conservatists, in that sense, all sorts of groups, which those, I think, to me, are probably some of the most interesting ones, because very often those initially oppose the far right because they see their political spaces being lost to the far right, but they're very often the ones that actually provide the hegemonic strength to the far right by absorbing a lot of their discourse. Then we have, again, the good old descendants of 20th century fascism, right? So, when you were talking about Mussolini or, the guys that we can safely call them fascists because that's what they are, and we can all agree with that. Then we have the Christian fundamentalists, the ones I was mentioning, for example, the whole kind of conglomerate around the evangelical church, but not only. In the case of the Spanish state, for example, the whole conglomerate around Opus Dei and all their links to parts of the financial sector and parts of the educational sector and also all sorts of those. And in certain contexts, such as Europe particularly, Islamophobia. And here, again, it is something quite characteristic of the Catalan case, because so far I've only mentioned two parties of the far right in Spain, Vox and Ciutadans, but over the last very recently, for the last 2 years or so, Catalonia is now a proud member of the global far right dynamics. It was quite easy to be Catalan until 2 years ago, with all the difficulties. It was easy because the fascists were almost always the Spanish, okay? And so, as a Catalan, you lived your life with relative ease in being an anti-fascist, because even those that in other countries would have been fascist or slightly friendly to fascists, in our case, for, as you probably know, historical reasons as well, everyone was pretty much an anti-fascist, even the kind of more Christian Democrats or some, you know, it was an easy thing. But it stopped very quickly, because this was a problem, amongst many other things. It stopped very quickly, and we now have our very own brand of fascism. And we have a party that, relatively small, with huge speakers in the media, but relatively small, that is characterized by extreme Islamophobia, absolutely extreme Islamophobia, much more than Vox, okay? In fact, Vox are relatively light in those terms in comparison to what we have, and very much a project designed to break the Catalan emancipatory movement. Okay? Very much a project of actually fulfilling the prophecy that they wanted, fulfilling the prophecy of saying all these kind of Catalans' attempts at independence is just like they're nationalist, identitarian, ethno-nationalist guys. We told you so. You kind of thought that they were doing some kind of revolutionary process. Look at it. It's not. It's that. Right? And it's very, very clear, that kind of thing. Then we have the anarcho-capitalists. In Europe, they're a bit less important, or we think they're a bit less important. But as I mentioned, I come from that dark future. They were very unimportant 2 years ago in the United States. They're not anymore. So we'll watch that space. And then the whole group that we very often don't think of them as the far right, but that are part of that kind of change in the hegemony, the kind of new age, conspirationalists, negationists, anti-vaxxers, eco-fascists, well, you know, kind of a big sack of nutters all put together in one place. And we have, I'm not going to go into it, we have very much a lot of money behind all of this. I'll talk about how that money actually gets spread, primarily through the Atlas Network, which is another foundation, but rather the Heritage Foundation basically tries to create ideology and strategy. Okay, that's their purpose. The Atlas Network instead tries to organize society. Those are the two main differences. The Atlas Network is all over the world. I recommend that you look in your own countries which foundations are there from the Atlas Network. They are spread absolutely everywhere, and they are funded, there are a lot of different foundations I mentioned, and they're funded by a lot of different interests: oil, tobacco, pharmaceutical interests, banks, etc., etc. Going to go a bit quicker on that. Just as so this is actually global data until 2015. The Atlas Network, sorry, I should be talking to the mic. The Atlas Network actually has grown exponentially since 2010, what a coincidence of a year, outside of the United States. Okay? So we have them everywhere. And we have them in Spain as well, and Spanish capitalists are also very interested, or Spanish capital, shall I say, are very interested in this. Why? I've put here some of the groups that have had at different points direct links with either sharing people on their board, on the board of one of the Atlas Network foundations. As you probably know, everywhere, Spain is not different. There is real difficulty in tracking funding of foundations. Private funding is kind of very difficult to track, so one of the things to do is actually looking at basically names, right? Who is on the board of such a place and whether that name actually finds in the board of such a place. Some of the ones I've put here, you might know them, I suspect you all know Santander Bank. Santander's bank represents the main interests of Spain's global and imperial financial interests. Amongst many things, Santander Bank is responsible for the, for example, Puerto Rican debt crisis of the previous decade. You know, they're really nice people overall. And not surprisingly, Grupo Eulen, that you might not have heard of, they're the largest contractor of the public sector. So if you ever find yourselves, I hope not, in a Spanish hospital, you will probably have your room cleaned by an employee of Grupo Eulen. You probably will eat in the canteen, and your food will have been cooked by someone from there. If you work at a university like I do, probably the person cleaning your office also works for them, in a school, etc., etc. Why would they be interested in the extreme right? Why don't they just interest themselves in making money? Because of what's been happening in the previous decade. When you actually have street politics, but also institutional politics, especially at the municipal level, calling for the municipalization of services, actually doing it, and removing all that money from you, your interests are at stake. And you start doing something about it. Similarly, I've put FCC, I could have put many others, and in fact, at the moment, there's quite a big scandal over this in Spain. This is one of the main construction companies, and makes most of its money through the construction of infrastructures, which, surprise to surprise, it's also public money. So whatever happens to that public money is something that interests me. And in Catalonia, since we now have our very own fascists, we have, and again, it kind of connects with the whole Israeli thing, probably the most media face in the rise of the extreme right is someone that many people wouldn't necessarily associate directly with that. It's the woman on the left. And she basically is someone that if you ever visit Catalonia and decide to watch Catalan TV, doesn't matter what time of the day you do so, you will probably see her at some point, okay? She basically appears in almost every program, receiving a lot of money, talking about everything and anything, because she knows about everything. And she is a self-recognized, so this is no conspiracy, I've not had to research this particularly hard. She is an Israeli lobbyist, okay? She considers herself part of the global Israeli lobby. Surprisingly, she is now in Latin America as part of a public-private partnership development, but that's something else. The middle one is our very own fascist. She is now the mayor of Ripoll, a lovely little town in the Pyrenees, very idyllic until now. And the town is known, perhaps unfortunately, because the guys that committed the terror attacks in Barcelona in 2017 were from that town. And partly that has given rise to her. And the other guy that you might not have seen before, the third guy, you might not have seen him, but if you have been to the Spanish state, you might have given him money. He owns the largest supermarket chain in the Spanish state, Mercadona, and is a regular funder of far-right parties. And then our own Catalan Atlas Network group, the Institut Ostrom, that actually tried to advance neoliberal policy, but part of the Atlas Network. In the Spanish context, you also have all these different intellectual constellations. I'm not going to go through them specifically, but to highlight that one of them, the CEU Cefas, is actually part of the Opus Dei private university conglomerate, just as a saying. And I'm just going to finish very quickly with one of the key arguments I make, which is that actually the Spanish state has to be understood, I think, not in relation to the development of the European far right, but rather in relation to the triangle that's being prioritized by the Atlas Network. And that triangle, as represented by the Foro Madrid, the map I've just placed there is actually a map from them. I haven't made that map. This is a map from the Atlas Network's Spanish section, which is the Foro de Madrid. And that map, to me, shows the connections between the United States far-right constellations with the Latin American constellations, and Spain as the connecting node with Europe, with Latin America, and with, very much so, the Spanish-speaking communities in the United States. Just as a quick example to finish, this is a news story from the publication Forbes, and it's from, in this case, actually from one of the Heritage Foundation staff. And he is a Latino guy. He probably would prefer to be called Hispanic guy in the United States. And he responded back to Spain getting a bit offended when Trump removed the White House website in Spanish, right? So Spain found themselves a little bit offended. You know, there's an attack on something very important, such as Spain's imperial past. And the response from the Heritage Foundation was to say, hey, Spain, you're nobody to come and give us lessons. You've got a right mess with the Catalans and the Basques and everything else. Your multilingual model clearly doesn't work to dominate people, which is what we're trying to do. So let us be monolingual for as long as we can. We don't want to listen to you. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you.